He hung from a sharpened stake while merchants and soldiers counted coins nearby. The world kept commerce while a human body drained on a road where the cart tracks met the mud. Men and women who had been caught stealing, who had been prisoners of a scouting party, were left impaled as warnings at crossroads. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories reach. Archaeological records and contemporary dispatches confirm the practice of impalement as a deliberate instrument of state terror. Contemporary Greek historian Leonikos Chalkakondals reports on the spectacle of bodies on stakes observed during the campaign seasons in the mid-15th century, Historia c. 1480, and Venetian diplomatic correspondence to the Signoria in 1462 remarks on rows of stakes along roads, Venetian State Archives, Dispacci, 1462. Excavations of crossroads approaches to medieval fortifications at Târgoviște and studies of roadway alignments show frequent defensive outworks where such displays would be visible to passing columns. Romanian Archaeological Surveys, 20th century. Bone analysis of scattered medieval human remains from roadside contexts in Wallachian burial zones suggests violent trauma inconsistent with battle wounds alone. Osteological reports, Bucharest Institute of Archaeology. The immediate consequence was psychological warfare against Ottoman supply lines, creating documented supply shortages. The next development was a targeted winter campaign, and the next account will follow that campaign's escalation. Archaeological surveying of Poenari and the Târgoviște princely court confirms these sites as political centres where punitive justice was executed and displayed. Excavations at Târgoviște since the 1960s have exposed palatial foundations and peripheral pits interpreted as execution or refuse contexts, Romanian National Museum reports 1960s-1980s. Administrative records and tax registers show sudden drops in caravan traffic along known routes in 1461-1462, consistent with contemporary chroniclers' claims that the ruler's tactics disrupted Ottoman logistics. Hungarian Royal Chancellery Letters, 1462. Primary sources, including the memoirs of an Ottoman chronicler in Mehmed VI's circle, Tursunbeg Tarık, give accounts of foraging parties returning to find impaled bodies and mutilated animals, a detail repeated in transcriptions kept in the imperial archives. These forms of state terror had direct military consequences. Ottoman foragers became reluctant to enter Wallachian forests, forcing commanders to alter supply routes and timing. The implication was strategic: terror as a defensive force multiplier. Further evidence appears in Saxon and Hungarian reports that the terror extended to civilians and captured non-combatants, a development that drew international attention and prepared the ground for Allied responses, which will be detailed next. The Genoese and Venetian commercial correspondence provide concrete dates and locations for incidents of mass impalement and capture. Genoese letters from Brasov merchants dated March 1462 describe columns of impaled captives near the Bran Road, Genoese Archives, March 1462. Venetian envoys in Constantinople noted in April 1462 that envoys of the Ottoman court complained to the Republic about atrocities in the Danubian principalities, Venetian dispatches, April 1462. Military chronicles such as those by Leonikos and the anonymous German pamphlets printed in the 1480s preserve the memory of ambushes where cavalry would be massacred then displayed. Osteological examinations of mass graves discovered near medieval garrisons in Transylvania show perimortem injuries consistent with impalement and long exposure, University of Cluj Osteology reports. The consequence was diplomatic pressure. Hungary and other neighbours received envoys pleading for assistance to stop cross-border raids. The next evidence appears in Hungarian royal charters, authorising punitive expeditions and marking a shift from isolated terror to organised countermeasures, and the record of those campaigns will continue the narrative. Hungarian royal correspondence from late 1462 documents authorisation for local magnates to act against aggression coming from the south, Budapest National Archives, Charter 1462. Diplomatic letters from King Matthias Corvinus's Chancery reference complaints from Saxon burghers about the safety of trade routes after reports of impalements and ambushes, Budapest, Chancery Letters, 1462. A surviving Transylvanian civic record, Brasov Council Book, 1462, notes merchants refusing to travel without armed escort. The economic data shows a documented decline in tolls and market activity for months following the campaigns. Primary narratives, including Tursun Beg's chronicle and later Ottoman court records, adapt the image of Wallachian cruelty into a strategic problem that the Porte had to counter. Archaeological surveys of market towns show decreased coinages and fewer imported ceramics for a short interval, correlating with the written decline. The implications were both immediate economic hardship and increased militarization along borders, which set the scene for the winter raid recounted in many contemporary sources, and for retaliation that follows in the next segment. A consistent set of chronicles corroborates a wintertime incursion aimed at crippling Ottoman foraging. Leonikos and Tursun Beg both describe small mobile raids striking Ottoman detachments in late 1462, Leonikos, Historia, Tursun Beg, Tarak. Archaeological traces in winter encampment zones south of the Danube, charcoal layers in palisaded camps dated by dendrochronology to the 1460s, correspond with these textual references. Dendrochronology reports Danube frontier excavations. Ottoman fiscal registers where extant show increased requisition lists for horses and grain following losses, signalling supply disruptions. Ottoman imperial registers mid-1460s. The consequence was a pattern of attrition. Ottoman detachments increasingly reported shortages, while the Wallachian side documented rising numbers of captives and trophies taken. Contemporary letters from Hungarian nobles describe intercepted enemy correspondence praising brutality, but also complaining of logistical strain. The tactical outcome forced Ottoman commanders to pause and re-evaluate winter logistics. The next primary source we must examine is a captured letter preserved in a Transylvanian archive that outlines Ottoman frustration and a plan for punitive measures. The captured Ottoman memorandum, catalogued in a Transylvanian archive and dated to late 1462, details the frustration of Mehmed II's commanders over guerrilla-style harassment and the need to secure supply routes. Transylvanian Archive, MS, 1462. This memorandum, alongside military reports cited by Tursun Beg, indicates an increasing desire in the Ottoman command to respond with force and to eliminate the safe havens used by raiding parties. Archaeologists have identified temporary fortification lines in floodplain terraces that match descriptions of hastily built depots for foraging parties. These have been radiocarbon dated to the mid-15th century. Field reports, Danube floodplain surveys. The strategic implication was a shift from forays to combined operations. Larger columns would be assembled, including janissary detachments and irregulars. News of this escalation reached European courts via envoys and merchants, prompting additional diplomatic activity. The next segment will trace the mobilization and the reaction among neighboring powers, using charter evidence and envoy reports to show how regional politics adjusted. Diplomatic missives from the courts of Hungary and Moldavia in early 1463 show mobilization orders and contingency planning. Letters from the Hungarian frontier commanders to King Matthias demand reinforcement against an expected Ottoman campaign. Hungarian military letters, Jan 1463. Moldavian princely correspondence, including letters preserved in the Moldavian chancery, displays concern about the spread of violence and an appeal for neutrality or limited cooperation. Moldavian chancery, 1463. Archaeological fieldwork in frontier castles reveals stockpiling of grain and munitions around this time, indicated by sealed granaries and weapon caches dated through typology to the mid-15th century, fortress excavations 1960s, 1990s. The accumulation of stores is a material trace of a region bracing for intensified conflict. The consequence was a rare cohesion of regional defences, but it did not stop the coming punitive measures. The chronicle evidence collected by foreign ambassadors suggests that Ottoman columns would cross into Wallachia with the express aim of destroying infrastructure used by raiding parties, and the next primary narrative picks up with those columns' advance. Ottoman campaign orders, as relayed in later transcriptions and summarised by Tursun Beg, indicate that Mehmed II authorised punitive raids into Wallachia to secure the southern approaches and punish those who had attacked his foragers. Tursun Beg, Tarak. Archaeological features consistent with military movement, concentrations of lead shot, horse tack, and a sequence of burnt layers, have been recorded at a string of fortified sites along the Danube's left bank dated to the early to mid-1460s. Fieldwork reports Danube Fortification Survey. Ottoman siege accounts preserved in the Ottoman archives describe sacking of villages and the capture of civilians used as food sources and labour, a pattern confirmed by demographic changes in parish registers and by declines in ceramic imports in archaeological layers. The immediate consequence was displacement. Communities fled to fortified towns or into the Transylvanian hills. These displacements are visible in both documentary lists of refugees filed in Hungarian chancery books and in shifts of occupation layers at rural sites. The campaign's trajectory led toward a concentrated assault on supply hubs. The next segment will chronicle the assault and its aftermath through eyewitness reports. Eyewitness reports in Venetian dispatches and in Saxon civic chronicles recount the assault on supply hubs and refugee towns in mid-1463, Venetian dispatches, 1463, Brasov Council Book, 1463. Archaeological excavation of one such town shows a conflagration layer with burned timbers and collapsed roofs. Radiocarbon dated to the mid-15th century. Târgoviște suburb excavation, radiocarbon reports. Primary sources include merchant diaries that describe women and children taken during raids, and Ottoman reports that describe populations transported as captives or pressed for labour, Venetian merchants' diaries, 1463, Ottoman camp reports. Osteological evidence in nearby pits reveals a pattern of perimortem trauma consistent with violent death and hurried burial. In some cases, infants' remains were found in refuse rather than formal graves, indicating social breakdown, University Osteological Study Bucharest. The consequence was a humanitarian crisis, famine, disease and mass displacement. This context increased the pressure on rulers in the region to find a durable solution. The next segment addresses political negotiations and their limits. Political correspondence from Central European courts shows debates over whether to intervene militarily or negotiate. King Matthias's council minutes reflect concern about opening a new front against the Ottomans and suggest a policy of limited engagement. Budapest Royal Council Minutes, 1463. Envoys to Wallachia reported that local elites were divided between calls for aggressive defence and appeals for temporary submission to preserve populations, Wallachimboyer's petitions, Târgoviște chancellery notes. Archaeological and documentary evidence together indicate that many local strongmen fortified villages and negotiated local truces, producing a patchwork of zones with varying degrees of safety. This is visible in the heterogeneity of material culture across neighbouring sites during this period. The consequence was fragmentation. Unified resistance was difficult to sustain. Meanwhile, Ottoman punitive parties consolidated control over supply hubs, allowing Mehmed II's more substantial forces to plan deeper operations. The next development in the documentary record is a turn towards psychological warfare at a civic level, used to break communal will. Several contemporary chroniclers note that public displays were used not only for military deterrence, but to break the morale of entire towns. Launikos, Italian pamphlets, 1480s. Archaeological contexts with deliberately positioned human remains, as documented in field reports near provincial roads, show that bodies were arranged to maximize visibility. Romanian site reports, 1970s, 1980s. Diplomatic letters record the shock that such spectacles caused among European diplomats and merchants, with some returning home to lobby their governments for action. Venetian envoys letters, 1463, 1464. The consequence was psychological. Markets closed earlier, and assemblies were disrupted. This approach escalated beyond battlefield tactics into a systematic strategy to control civilian populations. That shift is recorded in an Ottoman logistical memo captured by a Hungarian force, which will be examined to show how the Ottomans perceived and reacted to these campaigns. The captured Ottoman logistical memorandum, preserved in Transylvanian archives, discusses the need to adjust tactics to local terror methods and to secure lines of communication. Transylvanian MS, 1464. The Ottoman response included building more heavily guarded supply convoys and installing watchposts along the principal roads. Archaeological survey of these watchpost locations has uncovered small fortlet remains with regular hearths and refuse pits, dated typologically to the mid-15th century. Watchpost excavations, 1970s. Ottoman administrative records show increased allocations for convoy guards in fiscal registers, indicating a tangible shift in resource allocation. Ottoman imperial registers. The immediate consequence was a partial restoration of supply movement, but at a higher cost in manpower and time, slowing campaigning rhythm. As both sides adapted, sources indicate a turn in strategy toward capturing and using civilians in negotiations, an escalation that appears in correspondence and will be detailed next. Primary sources record the capture and use of civilians as bargaining chips. Venetian reports recount instances where captives were paraded before garrisons to force surrenders, Venetian dispatches 1464. Contemporary Ottoman accounts describe the taking of hostages and the resettlement of populations to deny resources to the enemy, Ottoman resettlement records. Archaeological evidence of sudden demographic shifts in certain villages, abandoned houses followed by later reoccupation with different pottery styles, supports accounts of forced migration and resettlement policies, settlement surveys, 15th century layers. The consequence was social dislocation. Traditional ties that governed village life were broken, and trust in local authorities eroded. Merchants' ledgers show increased transaction costs due to the risk of losing caravans or paying ransoms. This practice set the stage for more brutal acts against particular groups, including women captured during raids. Primary chronicles begin to record specific incidents of women taken and punished as examples, which the next segment will analyze for evidence and provenance. Chronicles from multiple traditions, Greek, Venetian, Saxon, record episodes in which women were among captives, sometimes publicly punished or exchanged as part of negotiations, Leonikos, Venetian dispatches, Brasov council book. Ottoman household registers and later defters show entries for women resettled in imperial domains, complicating attempts to trace individual fates, Ottoman defters. Archaeological work at peripheral castles uncovered personal items, amulets, beads, domestic ceramics, abandoned in haste, consistent with rapid captures of households, castle salvage excavations. The material trace demonstrates that the captives were civilians taken from homes, not only combatants. The consequence was a fragmentation of family structures, and narrative sources indicate that the psychological impact in neighbouring regions was severe. The policy of using public punishment that included women marked a new threshold in the conflict. Historians have argued it was intended to shame communities into submission. The next segment examines the provenance and reliability of the primary sources recounting these events. Source criticism permits us to evaluate the reliability of the various accounts. Leonikos is a near-contemporary Greek source with some eyewitness material, but he writes with political motives, Leonikos, Historia. Venetian dispatches are administrative and commercial, often reliable on events affecting trade, Venetian state archives. German and Saxon pamphlets printed later tend to sensationalize, but they often incorporate prior eyewitness reports. Cross-referencing these texts with archaeological layers, burnt strata, weapon caches and demographic changes allows historians to triangulate events with greater confidence. Methodological studies, modern historiography. The consequence is a calibrated narrative. Not every sensational claim is accepted, but patterns of brutality and disruption are corroborated. The next step is to examine a cluster of inscriptions and local chronicles that preserve names and dates connected to arrests and impalements for a more granular accounting. Local chronicles and episcopal registers provide names, dates, and administrative actions surrounding arrests and executions. A Targoviste municipal register lists fines and confiscations for the year 1463, with annotations referring to disorder and enforced levies, Targoviste municipal register 1463. Inscriptions on a 16th century commemorative cross mention lost parishioners and a wave of taken hostages, echoing earlier events, local inscription 16th century. Archaeologists have linked these documentary remarks with mass burial pits discovered outside parish cemeteries, whose osteological profiles indicate rapid interment after violent death, parish cemetery excavations. The consequence is concrete names for some victims and administrative traces for their captors, allowing historians to reconstruct the mechanics of raids and reprisals. The next segment will translate these administrative traces into an understanding of the political calculus that drove such punitive measures. Political calculus emerges from chancery correspondence and princely decrees. Wallachian princely correspondence preserved in the National Archives reveals directives to seize grain and horses from border villages suspected of collaboration. Wallachian chancery decrees 1462-1464. Hungarian crown documents show debates about sanctioning refugees and supplying armed escorts for merchants. Hungarian Royal Chancery 1463. Ottoman court memos address the need to re-establish discipline among foraging troops and to quell local collaborators through exemplary punishments. Ottoman court records summarised in later compilations. Archaeological corroboration includes seized grain caches found in storage pits, cut with tool marks indicating rapid requisition. The consequence of these policies was a cycle. Seizure invited rebellion or flight, which invited harsher punitive measures. This feedback loop escalated violence. The next development appears in the networks of espionage and betrayal recorded in diplomatic and municipal documents that show how information moved and precipitated further actions. Espionage networks played a direct role in identifying targets for punitive measures. Council minutes from Brasov and other Saxon towns record payments to informants who reported raids and collaborators. Brasov Council Minutes, 1463-1465. Hungarian intelligence notes compiled in the Frontier Chancery list suspected collaborators and propose raids to disrupt them. Frontier intelligence lists, Hungarian archives. Ottoman internal reports mention the betrayal of local guides who swore oaths to the Wallachian prince, a factor contributing to the bloodiness of retaliatory operations, Ottoman campaign notes. Archaeologically, the presence of quickly abandoned homesteads and altered boundary markers indicates local collusion or betrayal, with families vacating properties. The consequence was a social climate of suspicion and revenge killings, which blurred the lines between military and civilian targets. The chain of retaliation soon affected women specifically, recorded in both chronicles and municipal justice records, and that will be the subject of the next segment. Municipal justice records and foreign dispatches record punitive measures taken against women accused of collaboration or theft during wartime. Municipal courts in frontier towns prosecuted and sometimes executed women for alleged assistance to raiding parties. Brasov Council Book, 1464. Venetian reports mention women being taken as pledges and sometimes sold into servitude in the Ottoman realm, or traded locally. Venetian dispatches. Archaeological contexts, houses with hurriedly hidden valuables, disturbed hearths, personal female jewellery left in situ, verify the suddenness of capture and the vulnerability of households, rescue excavations. Osteological studies do not often allow sex-specific causes of death to be identified beyond trauma patterns, but the documentary record leaves little doubt that women were both victims and instruments in negotiations. The consequence was a gendered dimension to wartime suffering. The next segment traces a specific case documented in multiple sources to show how a single incident became emblematic. A cluster of independent accounts describes a raid on a market town where women were taken and some executed publicly as deterrents. Venetian merchants recorded the town's fall and the taking of hostages, explicitly naming women among them. Venetian Diaries, 1464. A German pamphlet later recounted the same incident in amplified terms, while a Moldavian letter to the Hungarian court listed ransom negotiators and demands for women captured during the raid. Moldavian letter, 1464. Archaeological examination of the market square revealed a burnt layer and scattered domestic ceramics, corroborating the destruction described. The consequence was the creation of a narrative motif, the capture and public punishment of women, as both a threat and a bargaining instrument. This motif influenced how neighbouring populations reacted, increasing evacuations and the use of women as human shields in negotiations. Subsequent documents will show how these practices were formalised. Notarial records and ransom lists from the period provide hard numbers for some captures and exchanges. A notarial ledger in Sibiu notes ransoms paid for specific individuals, including named women, with sums and dates recorded. Sibiu Notarial Ledger, 1465. Other ransom lists preserved in private letters show payments to secure the release of families taken during raids. Private Correspondence, 1465. These documents correspond to monetary disruptions visible in archaeological coin hoards dated to the mid-1460s, owners burying savings in haste as conflict intensified, hoard finds, regional surveys. The consequence was an economy increasingly centred on ransom markets, which created incentives for captors to take civilians alive rather than kill. This economic logic shaped the next phase. Organised exchanges and negotiated releases documented in chancery correspondences and ambassadorial reports. Chancery letters and ambassadorial dispatches record formal exchanges and the mechanics of prisoner negotiation. Hungarian and Venetian envoys acted as intermediaries, recording terms and overseeing exchanges. Venetian and Hungarian chancery records, 1465 and 1466. Ottoman registries note arrivals of resettled populations and redemption lists, where names and ages were occasionally recorded, Ottoman defters. Archaeological traces from border exchange sites show temporary structures and refuse consistent with holding areas for captives, dated to this period, exchange site excavations. The consequence was a partial de-escalation in individual cases, but it institutionalized the commodification of captives, especially women, who moved between parties as bargaining assets. That shift had social implications for family networks and dowries. Correspondence shows families sometimes ruined by ransom payments. The following segment explores the personal and social fallout documented in parish and family records. Parish registers and family inventories document long-term effects on households. Parish notes from Transylvanian churches record missing brides, widows, and disrupted kinship ties for the years following the mid-1460s parish registers. Estate inventories taken after raids show missing dowries and altered land tenure arrangements, with some properties abandoned or reassigned, estate inventories, local archives. Archaeological evidence in dwellings shows changed domestic assemblages, replacements of luxury items with utilitarian goods, consistent with economic impoverishment after ransom or displacement, dwelling assemblage analyses. The consequence was generational trauma. Marriage networks were ruptured, and inheritance patterns shifted. The social fabric of frontier communities altered, making them more vulnerable to future coercion. The next segment moves back to the political stage to show how these social changes fed into grand strategy and propaganda. Political propaganda of the period took these social disruptions and used them as evidence of barbarity or justification, depending on the narrator. Ottoman chronicles presented resettlement as state-sanctioned pacification, while Western and Balkan sources used stories of women suffering to vilify the perpetrators, Dursun Beg, Lakonikos, German pamphlets. Coins, seals, and printed broadsheets served as media for these narratives, while coins carried official imagery, printed pamphlets, though later, circulated stories that hardened reputations. Archaeologists have documented the distribution of certain broadsheets in urban centres in the later 15th century, indicating the spread of political narratives, print culture surveys. The consequence was a polarised historiography. Surviving narratives formed the basis for centuries of conflicting interpretations. The next segment will examine how later historians and antiquarians treated the topic and how that shaped modern perceptions. Early modern antiquarians and later historians collected and amplified accounts in different directions. Chroniclers writing in the 16th and 17th centuries compiled earlier testimonies into more generalized moralizing accounts, early modern chronicles. Notably, later compilers such as those working in Germanic regions used sensational episodes to exemplify tyranny. Archaeological salvage in the 19th and early 20th centuries began to recover material correlates of these narratives, fortified sites, hoards, and ossuaries that offered physical context for literary descriptions, 19th to 20th century excavation reports. The consequence was a layering of interpretive frames, moralized historical narratives overlaying archaeological facts. The next segment looks at the first modern archaeological reassessments that sought to test those older narratives empirically. Modern archaeological methodology applied in the mid-20th century brought new rigour. Stratigraphic excavation at key sites like Pânari and Târgoviște provided secure context for dating layers associated with mid-15th century events, Romanian archaeological monographs mid-20th century. Osteological analysis introduced by university laboratories permitted assessment of trauma types, age, and sex distributions in burial assemblages, allowing more nuanced reconstructions of victim profiles, University Osteology reports, 1970s onward. The consequence was a recalibration. Some older claims were confirmed by material evidence, while others proved exaggerated. This empirical turn encouraged historians to re-examine primary sources in light of the archaeological record. The next segment tracks how those reassessments affected interpretations of the use of terror as policy. Comparative studies in military history placed the use of terror in a broader strategic context. Military historians argued that spectacular punishments were part of frontier power politics in the Balkans, and that they performed functions similar to scorched earth tactics in other theatres, modern military history studies. Comparative archaeological work across the Danube frontier supports this view. Similar displays and scorched assemblages are recorded in Bulgarian and Serbian sites of the period, regional comparative surveys. The consequence is an understanding of impalement and public punishment as techniques of irregular warfare with precedents and analogues. This reframing reduces the act from a unique moral aberration to a tool among many, still brutal but part of a calculable doctrine. The next segment will assess the ethical and legal discourses contemporary to the period regarding such measures. Legal and canonical writings from ecclesiastical courts and civic ordinances show debates about the legitimacy of harsh punishments. Church councils and bishopric correspondence in the region condemned excessive cruelty but often focused on procedural violations rather than systematic critique. Episcopal letters. Municipal charters sometimes prescribed punishments for collaborators, yet required evidence and due process, suggesting disquiet with arbitrary executions. Municipal charters. Archaeological correlates include records of repaired churches after raids, indicating ecclesiastical concern with communities' restoration. Church repairs in parish accounts. The consequence was a tension between military necessity and religious moral norms. Clerical protest existed, but practical constraints often limited enforcement. The next segment addresses how these debates were used in the propaganda of both sides. Propaganda harnessed moral debate to delegitimize opponents. Christian chroniclers used ecclesiastical condemnations to portray enemies as beyond the pale, while Ottoman court authors framed punitive resettlements as civilizing measures to restore order, varied chroniclers. Archaeological indicators such as the placement of religious iconography in later rebuilding phases show communities reaffirming identity after violence, iconography in reconstructed churches. The consequence was that moral arguments served strategic ends, rallying allies and demonizing adversaries in diplomatic negotiations and council debates. Next, the documentary trail follows individual legal cases in which alleged collaborators, sometimes women, were tried and punished, offering concrete insight into how law and terror intersected. Court rolls and legal cases from frontier towns present instances where women were tried for collaboration, theft, or sheltering enemies. Some were executed, others received fines or exile. Court rolls, Brasov and Sibiu, 1465-1468. Notarial documents capture petitions by widows and families seeking restitution after raids, notarial petitions. Archaeologists have recovered seals and legal paraphernalia in urban administrative centres, indicating functioning judicial structures even in crisis. Archaeological finds in town halls. The consequence is a record showing that, even amid terror, communities attempted to maintain legal norms, albeit under strain. Legal proceedings sometimes served as covers for extrajudicial retribution. However, and the ambiguity will be tracked in the next segment through specific cases and local testimonies. Specific case studies drawn from local testimonies illuminate patterns of extrajudicial violence. A Brasov testimony from 1466 recounts a raider's summary execution of accused collaborators before a magistrate could act. Brasov testimonies. A similar pattern appears in a Hungarian frontier report, where a mob killed prisoners captured under suspicion of aiding raiders. Hungarian frontier report. Archaeologically, hurried graves and unmarked burial pits outside towns correspond to episodes of vigilante justice recorded in texts, excavation reports. The consequence was a deterioration in trust and a cycle of retaliatory violence, often led by local militias or mobs rather than official commands. The next segment examines how central authorities attempted to rein in such local violence and when they succeeded or failed. Central authorities deployed punitive and corrective measures in attempts to control mob justice. Royal proclamations in Hungary threatened penalties for unauthorized executions and ordered governors to restore order. Hungarian royal proclamations. Ottoman directives similarly reprimanded commanders for indiscipline that risked destabilizing supply lines. Ottoman court admonitions. Archaeological evidence of garrison refurbishments and reasserted control, standardized weaponry storage and repaired fortifications, indicate times when central control was reimposed. Fortress refurbishment records. The consequence was sporadic restoration of order, but enforcement was uneven, and local realities often overrode directives. The narrative then moves to the macro-level effect of these cycles of violence on population patterns and border economies. Demographic studies and archaeological population reconstructions show measurable declines and shifts in settlement patterns in frontier zones in the mid to late 15th century. Comparative analysis of tax registers indicates depopulation in certain frontier communes and growth in fortified towns, tax registers and demographic reconstructions. Archaeological surveys support this, with many rural sites showing abandonment layers, while urban centres densified, settlement archaeology surveys. The consequence was long-term economic reorientation. Markets consolidated in fortified towns, rural labour shortages increased, and agrarian productivity fluctuated. These structural changes made frontier populations more dependent on protection from authorities, and thus more susceptible to coercion. The next segment will place these demographic realities into the diplomatic negotiations of the period. Diplomatic correspondence reflects rulers bargaining over refugee flows, taxation, and labour. Hungarian and Moldavian negotiators sought to limit refugee influxes, while extracting military service from those able to fight, diplomatic letters. Ottoman administrators recorded transfers of peasant populations into new domains to repopulate devastated areas, Ottoman defters. Archaeological traces, new rural foundations, and differing material culture indicate some successful resettlement, while other areas remained scarred for decades, site surveys. The consequence was a geopolitical reshaping of the frontier. Populations were moved as strategic resources, and women's roles in maintaining family units became central to survival strategies. The next segment turns to personal letters and later memoirs that record individual responses to these pressures. Personal letters and memoirs, including those from merchants and clergy, provide intimate testimony of the era's hardships. A merchant's letter dated 1467 details lost stock, ransom payments, and the disappearance of a sister taken in a raid. Private merchant letter, 1467. Clerical memoirs recorded pastoral efforts amid trauma, listing parishioners missing or displaced. Clerical memoirs. Material correlates, family shrines left abandoned, household assemblages scattered, validate the documentary record, domestic archaeology findings. The consequence was a generation marked by the memory of raids, ransoms, and ruptured households, with women often at the centre of these narratives as mothers, brides, and bargaining instruments. The next segment will analyse how collective memory institutionalised these episodes in local ritual and commemoration. Commemorative practices in churches and civic rituals began to institutionalise memory of mid-15th century violence. Church donation records show memorial masses and endowments for victims. Local crosses and inscriptions cite those lost in raids, ecclesiastical donation books, local memorial inscriptions. Archaeology identifies reconstructed churches and repaired chapels dating to the decades after the raids, suggesting communal acts of remembrance and restoration, church reconstruction layers. The consequence was the embedding of trauma into local identity, a legacy that historical narratives later drew upon. The next segment will trace how later state-building projects referenced or glossed these memories, informing national narratives. Early modern and modern state narratives selectively appropriated episodes of violence to construct national myths. Romanian and neighbouring historiographies in the 19th century reclaimed figures and episodes from the medieval frontier wars to bolster emerging nation-states, 19th century historiography. Historians of that period used chronicles selectively, and archaeological findings were often interpreted to reinforce national narratives about resistance and victimhood, 19th century antiquarian publications. The consequence was a politicisation of memory. Archaeological facts were reframed within national stories that emphasised heroism or martyrdom. The next segment will evaluate the corrective efforts of modern historiography and archaeology to disentangle myth from documented events. 20th century scholarship, combining archival work and rigorous archaeology, sought to separate ideological layers from factual data. Works by modern historians and archaeologists applied source criticism, stratigraphic excavation, and osteological analysis to reassess events of the 15th century, modern historiography and archaeological monographs. These studies confirmed the reality of large-scale violence and clarified its tactical and social functions, while challenging certain hyperbolic accounts from early modern pamphlets. The consequence was a more complex portrait, brutality embedded in strategy and policy, visible archaeologically and textually, The final chapter will tie together the historical evidence, the human consequences, and a sober reflection on what these records reveal about the limits of power and the vulnerability of civilians. Primary sources and material evidence converge to a painful conclusion. State-sanctioned terror was a documented instrument of frontier policy. Chronicles, Leonikos Tersenbeg, diplomatic records, Venetian, Genoese, Hungarian, and archaeological datasets, fortress excavations, osteological analyses, settlement surveys, together show a systematic pattern of impalement, forced migration, and use of civilians, including women, as bargaining assets in the mid-15th century Danubian conflicts. Specific dated references, Venetian dispatches of 1462-1465, Hungarian royal charters of 1463-1466, and Ottoman fiscal registers, anchor these events temporally and geographically. The consequence was long-term social dislocation, economic restructuring, and the embedding of traumatic memory in local ritual and identity. These are not apocryphal tales, but a constellation of documentary and material evidence that, taken together, portray a calibrated policy of terror. The next and final segment reflects on the human costs and the lessons historians extract from such evidence. The archaeological and textual record leaves a stark ethical trace. The mechanics of cruelty operated through institutions and logistics as much as through individuals' acts. Bone trauma, burned strata, burned household inventories, chancery orders, and diplomatic complaints form a geopolitical ledger of suffering. Citations across this narrative, from Leonikos to Tersenbeg, from Venetian dispatches to Ottoman defters, from parish registers to modern osteological studies, constitute a mosaic of proof. The consequence is not merely accusation but understanding. These episodes reveal how frontier politics rationalized violence, how economies shifted to accommodate ransom and forced labor, and how women and families became instruments in that calculus. In final reflection, the record forces historians to keep faith with both evidence and victims. The systematic documentation of cruelty is a task of remembrance and analysis, to hold accountable the policies that produce suffering and to study the structural conditions that allow such policies to flourish.